let us talk about public scholarship. I want to ask both you, Rachel, and Chenjerai to talk about how do you define public scholarship? Why do we see scholarship as not public? And how do we make our scholarship accessible, especially fugitively? Feel free to answer that question, audience in the chat. Do you want to go first, Chenjerai?
Sure, I'll definitely jump in. So let me first of all say welcome to be here. Welcome to, thank you so much for having me here. And I want to thank you to the people that it took to put something like this together. Every time you have something like this, there's a lot of people behind the scenes doing work. All the meaningful work is collective. So thank you for that. And welcome to everybody who's here. In terms of how I define public scholarship, I do think it's really important for us to, first of all, oh, wow. My screen is jumping around real crazy. I hope this doesn't interrupt. But I think it's important for us to think about the scholars the people who have state communities that universities are gentrifying, that they're involved with, the communities who may not have access to the university, the various kinds of workers in the university, including not just like non-tenure track professors, but also, other kinds of workers and things like that. So I think that all those things are important. Just to check, my computer's doing really weird things. Can you all hear me?
Your image is freezing a little bit, but your audio is coming in clear. So we definitely
okay. That's good.
The university is a project of empire for sure.
So in that regard, I think that's kind of how I define public scholarship. And I've been involved in projects like I did some work with an organization called One Hood in Pittsburgh that was doing kinds of critical media literacies around race. And I wanted to do something that would, work with them, try to get Penn State to support their work a little bit at the time when I was doing that. A lot of people know me because of my podcast work, and the podcast work has become a form of political education, but also a way that communities can create, archives of their history, and we can push back on dominant narratives of American history. But in doing those kinds of work, a lot of times I was experimenting and trying to innovate and sort of flailing as I tried to figure it out. And the sort of brilliant scholars that we had in the previous panel seem to have taken a step forward in terms of knowing how to actually do this in the university in a way that maybe uses the resources better. But I just want to finish by saying that I think there's like 4 core challenges that I think about when I think about the challenge of public scholarship that we have to think about. The first has to do with time, right? Because if you're talking about, for example, working with a community who's doing, you're doing work on prison, or you're doing work on, health, women's health, or you're doing work on whatever, the child welfare system, or, various kinds of things that affects, communities, vulnerable or marginalized communities, it takes time to build those relationships, right? It takes time to get them to hear what they want, right? Not what your research goals are, but what they need actually from the university, right? That they might even be paying taxes to with many of these universities, right? So I think that's important. But we often don't have the time because the corporatization and privatization of these universities and the pace that we're expected to work at means you got to think about being efficient. And efficiency often translates into extraction, an extractive approach. I'm coming in, getting what I want, not just because of some vague notions of like anti-Blackness and those things, but because of actually a sort of economic, governance arrangement in which efficiency is the primary research value, So I think that's one thing. And then I think we got to also think about, and I'm just going to mute my image just to not be distracting, in case that helps. But I think that secondly, there's the form of our research. I have done a lot of work through the podcast, and we have scholars who are doing work through film, through things that are, things that Sasha's doing are much more even innovative than that, on blockchain, whatever you want to call it. And I think that the question, I think, for fine arts programs or programs that have already thought through issues of making as knowledge production, those things are not really an issue. But if you're in a research one kind of context where they're saying, okay, what counts is peer-reviewed articles and or scholarly books, then you're going to have to fight a battle around form and proving that, to what extent, how does this form translate into notions of rigor, of blind peer review and things of this nature, right? And ultimately of systematic knowledge production. So time, form is an issue. And then I would say interdisciplinarity is an issue. There's a lot of talk in the university about being interdisciplinary, a lot of gestures around it. But when it comes to actually, like engaging with other disciplines or assessing a work that may not be, primarily dealing with work in for example, in communications, then it starts to be like, if for example, the criteria for tenure or for promotion is what contributions have you made to this discipline? And it's expected that's going to happen within the boundaries of this discipline, drawing primarily only on the literatures of this discipline. That's an obstacle, because for the kinds of critical work that we're talking about doing, you must draw on the Black feminist tradition. You must draw on radical queer tradition. You must draw on geography. You must draw on all these things that may not be a part of your discipline. And then, as Rachel has brought up at different times, you got to draw on knowledge that hasn't even made it sort of into the academy yet at all. So you have to navigate that and then face your discipline and make that kind of case. And which then also takes us to the final thing I would mention, which is assessment. So I think that in closing, thinking about public scholarship means being able to fight a battle around all of those different things, for lack of a better metaphor, to cook a meal with all those ingredients, I think is how I think about public scholarship and the challenge of it. Sorry for my technical difficulties.
No, that was great. That was really comprehensive in terms of laying out some problematics that we will dive into in greater detail throughout this workshop. Rachel, what would you say to this question?
Yeah, thank you for that. And Chenjerai, I love that you first brought us both to the university and the project of empire, and also the university and the academy's role, right? In industry and also in production, right? And how those logics of capital and production are also feeding into this kind of work that we do that make it really difficult to kind of think about well, what is public engagement in ways that is non-extractive when, right? We're working in an industry that is extracting a lot of time and labor from people. So I appreciate you for naming all those things. For me, when I think about public scholarship, right, it is these forms of intellectual labor and knowledge production, not just for communities and publics outside of academia, but also in service of these broader goals of collective struggle and liberation, right? That the kind of form of public scholarship is also political, right? Knowledge production is political, but I think public scholarship is also rooted, I think, in this, in political movements and in service, I think, of social movements and change. And so I think that is really important to kind of think about that it isn't in isolation of those things. And I think to your point, Chenjerai, so much of this knowledge production, especially also in movement spaces, right, does not become a kind of formal output that you can cite. It's not a research article. It's not, right, a press piece. It's often happening in these kinds of spaces where people are in rooms together. Now it's Zoom, right? But it might also be in the back room of an office as people are thinking through ideas and building shared political analysis together, happening, right? On text threads. A lot of the spaces that I'm in, those forms of how are we thinking through ideas in collectivity is not public and right, and it also is not individual. And so many of the ideas that I've been working through are coming from spaces of being able to think with other people. And so how do you cite those? How do you acknowledge those? And how do we really think about that? I think for me, going back to that point that you made about time being such a challenge, I think so much of doing community engagement and public scholarship is about relationship building outside of research. And I think this was definitely said in the last panel, right? That relationships come first and they can't just be predicated on research only as that only object of relationship building, right? And so there's a kind of depth of relationship that needs to happen without regard to a research output, and really focusing on that process over output, which takes so much time and is often not valued by the university or also by funders, right? And you need often funding to resource community work because people are working on really limited time, really limited staff, really limited resources. So it does right? Like you need funding for that, but like, how do you translate that when often funders are like, well, what is the added value? What is the final output? When sometimes you're like, we really just need the resources to even think and build out a project and spend some time like getting to know each other and build alignment. So I think that is a huge part of it. I think this kind of myth of individualism in the academy is also a huge hindrance, right? And I think to that point of interdisciplinarity, there's often this like myth of the scrappy solo interdisciplinary researcher who like knows how to do qualitative methods really well and quantitative and like deep community engaged work and doing it all alone, right? And that myth I think is really harmful, especially I think for junior scholars where you're kind of just like navigating these spaces for the first time. And so that kind of myth of individualism also creates these tenuous relationships, I think, between community and researchers, and right, like plays up that idea of extraction of resources and time, because there's this kind of idea that we're all operating under models of scarcity when that doesn't need to necessarily be the case. And so I think like those are all kinds of things that I'm thinking about when we're thinking about like what does it mean to produce public scholarship and to produce knowledge as part of this kind of longer term and iterative process. So I'll pause there and pass it back over to you.
I just jump in with one quick example? You know, I remember when I was doing some research on One Hood, and this is this sort of group, activist group, media group in Pittsburgh, and you know, I had all these things that I was taught in my head, which was sort of the exact opposite of what Rachel just said, right? Like form a relationship with the research subject, and then, you know, figure out how you're going to cease that relationship later on after you've extracted the data. You know, I had like, and make sure that you get consent so that you can shield yourself against legal liability. So I had like all this shit in my head, right? So, but I was also excited because in my mind, like I was like, aren't you happy that I'm studying what you're doing? And I remember talking to Paradise Gray in like the first day of my research, and I needed him to sign this consent form, right, for IRB. And so he just launches into talking about the work. He's like, yeah, here's what we do. And he's showing me stuff and it's all great, but he hasn't signed it. I'm just nervous. And so I was just like trying to cut in. So at a certain point I cut in and I said, yo, I said, hey, are you interested for me to just tell you a little bit about my project? And then he just looks at me and he goes, fuck your project. And I never forgot that fuck your project, because I think it just speaks to, you know, a lot of these challenges we're talking about. I just wanted to share that little story.
That's a great anecdote. I would be chiming in throughout this workshop, but probably not as much. I just wanted to sort of say, yeah, y'all kind of covered the definition and problematics as well as the previous panel. For me, it is about knowledge co-creation, and it's about sharing both the process and the outputs of that knowledge co-creation. All of the public scholarship I've done have been about this exchange with the public generally. You know, initially when I was in grad school, I was sort of extracting data, interviewing independent television creators, and I was sharing by just blogging about what I read. And I did find that people liked when I publicly shared their interviews because they were learning from what other creators were doing in the process of doing that. But for me, it still felt extractive. And so I kind of went towards deeper forms of collaboration when my partner and his theater production company in New York, very indie, like not a big company, said that they wanted to do a web series. And I was like, oh, well, I'll help you make that. And maybe I'll learn something about web series by actually working with people to make it. And I did. I learned so much about the risks and the challenges and the complications and all the things you don't get when you interview with someone. So when I got to Northwestern, I was like, okay, let me try and do that on a bigger scale. And that is really where OTV came from. And I learned so much by doing it on a bigger scale. I really felt like we were co-creating this thing together. And yet what I learned over time was that the exigencies of tenure, right, and having to produce and needing to get specific forms of data on a specific time frame in order to do that was causing me to miss all of these things that were going on. You know, when you think about relationship building, I was very close with all of the artists I work with in my team. I had them over for dinner. We like spent a lot of time with each other, but like we were still very work focused, right? Like they were like, I need to make this web series. How can you help me? And I was like, okay, I'll help you. Can I write about this? You know, and it was still kind of transactional. And one of the things I've been learning more recently is the importance of a restorative justice framework and process to have with your work, especially if you're doing work that deals with like capital and power and these really big issues, not only just to mediate conflict, but also just to remind everyone involved that like you're all humans, despite this political, economic, whatever kind of process you are trying to both study, understand, and transform. And I can talk about that a little bit more later. It's been something that I didn't think I was doing and studying when I came into it, but now so much of what I'm writing about is about the ways in which this work is both healing, not only healing and repairing systems and systemic oppression, but also like each other and your own stuff, right? So yeah, that's what I would add in terms of my understanding of public scholarship. And we really wanted to spend quite a bit of time sort of thinking through the challenges and possible solutions to those challenges through like case studies, both the process of how we are doing public scholarship, or how traditional scholarship informs the public, vice versa, the shape that it takes, what are the outputs of that process, and then the assessment and institutional structures that those outputs enter, and the challenges of sort of conveying all of that in the final products, right? So Rachel, I was wondering if you could start talking about process and some of the work that you've been doing.
Sure, I'm going to quickly share my screen a little bit, just so everybody can see some examples. And so I think where I want to just offer up as like a concrete kind of case study has been these zines that I've been making through my role in the Asian American Feminist Collective, right? Like we often think about like knowledge production in the academy as like, right, as has been named, right? Like it's the peer-reviewed journal article, it's like the book, right? Like maybe sometimes public scholarship is seen as like a white paper, right? That like kind of gets into policy. But I think for me, some of these like creative forms that are done collectively with other people has been a kind of site of public knowledge production that I have found really fruitful. And so the zine is a form, and I can kind of mark this along like different trajectories of also my journey as a graduate student up until now as like a postdoc. But the very first zine that I ever did with the Asian American Feminist Collective was called Building an Asian American Feminist Movement. And we put it together kind of after I had done my comprehensive exams, actually, and had like spent a lot of time reading critical race theory, reading about empire, about criticisms, right, of capitalism, political economy, and thinking really a lot about like race and relation and how do we think about that in communication studies. And so kind of assembling like a lot of those ideas, which, right, like often the kind of time to space to read a lot of books is something that is like a something that happens in academia that often, right, like is not as accessible to people who are working other jobs and doing other forms of work. And so, and often like that kind of reading of those theories is not always readily accessible and legible, right? Like it's often sometimes really dense. So what does it mean to translate it into another form? And so with a group of other people, we kind of like put down some collective thoughts in a Google Doc and circulated more publicly on Twitter and invited people to add to it and to really start building out, right? Like if we were to imagine an Asian American feminist movement, what would it look like? And so this was like a public Google Doc that people could comment on, collaboratively write. And we adjusted a lot of that content then back into the zine to set out this kind of idea of like, what is a starting place if we're, or not a starting place, but building on previous movements and ideas, right? Like in terms of like where we were in 2018, if we were thinking about Asian American feminism in this moment. And so that was like a kind of like first zine and process and form that emerged, right? Like also out of a space that I was thinking through that is like this weird process, like in academy, right? Like around like these kinds of barriers or next steps in the next, right? Like the kind of comprehensive exam. The second zine that we had made was a history zine, how to make history. And that also kind of came out of conversations like with somebody else where we were talking about how exclusionary institutional archives are, right? And the institutional archive is also this very strange space that often like people of color are often excluded from, right? Like in stories and histories about like communities of color are often not there. And then when they are, it's this weird space where you might have like movement records that were public forms of scholarship and knowledge in the first place, like now are entered into this institutional archive that is really difficult for the public to actually access, right? And so there's like a kind of like weird way of like when something becomes archived, before it was like this kind of public form and circulated and now foreclosed. And so it was a kind of way to rethink like, A, what are the ways that histories are made outside of these institutional archives and made significant? And then also what were ways to kind of like bring in some of the archival materials that people were finding and put it and translate it into the zine form, right? And circulate archival materials in a different way. So that was the kind of impetus of the second zine of like, what is feminist history making? And then the last one that has been, or the third one that has been more recent as of last year, March 2020, was that we were starting to do community, gathering some community stories of what was happening to Asian Americans at the start of the pandemic and being able to connect that with writing, theorizing that was already happening in movement spaces that was thinking through questions from disability justice, from abolition movements, to think through like, how are we making sense of this moment in the pandemic when people like no longer don't have access to adequate social safety nets, when there's like these multiple forms of racism that are compounding, and a zine that that would translate different materials to do that. So this is like some examples, right, of like a different forms and processes that public scholarship can take that are also very part of these collective endeavors to make things together. And I would say, right, like in the making of this third zine, it has created so many possibilities for new relationships. Out of the zine, the Asian American Feminist Collective has been in conversation with Black women radicals, and we've been doing like a 2-year folio now together about how do we talk about feminist solidarities in these different forms and create different media projects moving forward. So those are just some examples. And so I'll pause, share there, and happy to talk more about any of those.
Yeah, and if you could post that last link and maybe even the previous link in the chat or Discord, that would be great. And I'll also put it in our document for dissemination later. That was excellent. I was just saying in the Discord how I love how you flipped the exclusionary institutional practice into one that was public and co-creative. Truly brilliant. Chenjerai, let's talk about process for you.
Yeah. Okay, absolutely. I want to share like 3 quick examples, and hopefully I can do that in like 10 less than 10 minutes, if that's enough time, if that's short enough. And I'm gonna and I want to go from a range of things that kind of worked and where I felt like I actually had like severe limitations. All of these projects, by the way, are replete with ethical compromises and limitations, but one where there was more limitations because of the corporate context, and then to talk about ones where I felt like I took a step closer to a vision of the social. So just to share my screen briefly here, and some sound. So the first one I would like to share, and I'll just kind of, is this thing I did. This is a part of my podcast, Uncivil. Uncivil is a podcast where we tried to kind of push back against the vision of the Civil War that was presented in something like Ken Burns' documentary, and really, which is the dominant view of the Civil War, and kind of give people a people's history via podcast of the Civil War. And so in this particular episode, we were trying to understand how culture also functions as part of Civil War memory, and how culture becomes linked to some of these battles in a context where like there's a lot of conversations about monuments and statues. So we talked to a group called the Carolina Chocolate Drops, because we were doing an episode on Dixie, and we had heard that there was a Black musician who plays Dixie on stage, and we were like, wow, okay, we want to hear more about that. So what I'm going to play for you is a moment in the interview that was kind of awkward, actually. It was where this guy, Justin Robinson, from the wonderful group, The Chocolate Drops, you know, I kind of asked him if this was ever weird, the fact that he produces this kind of old time Black music on stage in front of audiences who are often white. And here was how he answered that.
It got weird, and it continued to get weirder.
Is there a particular moment where you were like, that you remember where you were like, this is like this is really weird?
Yeah, I can tell you the time. It became a little too much.
So, you know, there's a lot of interesting things about that moment, but he talked about being on a bus headed to a tour date in Charleston, South Carolina. And, he like woke up in the middle of the night on the bus, and this is what sort of happened at that moment.
We got to the festival grounds. It was a bluegrass festival in Charleston. We got on into the property. I was asleep in the van, and I sat up straight because I didn't know, at this point, I didn't know where the gigs were. I just got in the van and shut up. And I was like, where are we? My spirit felt wrong. And as we pulled up, I was like, oh.
It was a place Justin had known about since he was a kid, Boone Hall.
Boone Hall is one of the first plantations that are that is in Charleston, the big fancy place, like Gone with the Wind, Terra kind of plantation.
And then they got on stage.
And there was nothing but white people in there. And so that was like, we might be doing something wrong. That's what I felt in that moment. I was like, the irony is not lost on me that we were at a plantation playing fiddle and banjo for an all-white audience in Charleston, South Carolina. I was like, this is so palatable. They love it because it makes them feel comfortable.
So, this was, it was an important moment to get on tape, and we were able to, and a lot of people said that this was one of their favorite episodes of our podcast, and it got a lot, we won a Peabody Award for Uncivil, it hit millions and millions of downloads. But within this corporate model, there's really not much of a chance once the ad real estate dollars have been made and the data extraction has taken place, to follow up on that, to follow up with the chocolate drops, to talk to that community, to engage. What does this have to do with radical struggle, with land reclamation, all these questions about culture? The space isn't there because you're literally just trying to produce the next podcast episode, right? And so I think there's some limitations to this form of public scholarship, even though I'm proud of that. A podcast that I'm not going to play, but I just want to play where I took a step closer was that illustrates a different set of tensions, was a podcast I did with Intercepted, and I was able to interview Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And part of the dynamic there with the public scholarship as a cis hetero Black man is that because I'm someone who has stuff out there, I often get invited to speak on things that I'm not really an expert in. Okay, there might be things that I'm studying, like I have definitely studied the politics and history of prison abolition and prisons and police a lot, but as much as I've studied it, I'm not, I'm essentially still see myself as very early, and yet I get these platforms. So one challenge of public scholarship in that situation was for me to set the conditions and go, yeah, it would be fly to host an episode of The Intercepted, but I'm not going to do it unless I can find a way for, who I am, to actually be, pushing back against that. And so once we realized it was possible to interview Ruth, and that it would actually be helpful for me to interview Ruth because I could actually do the heavy lifting of the sort of production work while she could do the heavy lifting of the intellectual work. And I could create a space to center this Black woman who's been not sufficiently centered in this conversation. Then it becomes the criteria conditions that justifies me doing that. You see what I'm saying? And so like that, but again, it still is Intercepted, still kind of a corporate context, even though one that I think is a really important space, but limited. So the final example I want to play is one that was a little bit better. And I had been outside of the academy, outside of this, well, actually not really fully outside of the academy, in the sense that we have something called the Mike Center, which I'll just do a quick plug for, at the University of Pennsylvania. Sarah is one of the directors of this, Sarah Jackson, who was on earlier. And we try to do research at this intersection. So I asked the Mike Center for funds because I had been studying Amazon and resistance at Amazon plants. And so one of the things that I did was I talked to Amazon workers and said, I would like to make an episode that supports your work. And it was interesting because initially the leader of the DCH1 plant in Chicago was very skeptical, right? He was initially like, I'm only want to do something that's going to be useful to other workers. So if it's for your like research purposes and your study and all that, those aren't goals I'm interested in. Pitching. So I had to think about narrating it, and we had to have a negotiation about what would be useful. And then I interviewed a person who was in there, who was organizing with DCH1. And what we found out was that this was during the COVID pandemic, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly, but this was during the COVID pandemic. And the narrative in the media at that time was the pandemic is politicizing all these workers, right? But when I actually talked to these workers and formed a real relationship with them, what they told me was, no, actually we had been engaged in struggle long before the pandemic. And the inaugurating struggle that they fought was about something really simple. It was about water. They literally did not have enough water in the plant, and they had to organize to get water. So what I did was I actually did a story about that, and I'll play you the moment when the workers confronted their boss about water.
Shift.
All the associates surrounding the manager for the night, we're stretching, they're telling us about the goals, about the night before, what the expectations are for the night, any safety tips. And then a coworker of ours was like, yeah, we got a safety tip. In fact, 150 of us do. We want water. The manager started freaking out. He got all nervous. And he was like, yeah, I'll take care of this right away. And then someone else said, okay, but when? It's like, yeah, I'll take care of it right away, right now. It's like, okay, you guys are always saying you'll take care of it right now, but you guys never do. Like, we're demanding water for right now. We want water right now for tonight. And the manager was freaking out. There was a lot of people coming in from different directions. You know, it's a circle. Everyone's surrounding them. So he was freaking out. He didn't know what to do. And he just dismissed the meeting, and he ran. And, he was on his phone the whole time texting, I'm guessing, the site lead or something for backup or for help. I don't know. And he ran out to the nearest grocery store and bought cases of water bottles for everyone.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, he took care of that right away. We were actually really surprised. And for the next couple of days, they kept bringing in pallets of bottled waters for everyone. I think
So I'll stop there, but basically they were able to get the whole new water system installed in the Amazon system. It stopped just being about cases of water. So just to kind of close on this, that was I felt like that was better because it served workers and all these other things. But when it comes to issues of assessment and how any of this work will be assessed in my career, these things took a lot of effort and were satisfying and helpful in some ways, but I don't know that they were helpful to my career, actually. I also just want to shout out, in addition to the Mic Center, I do want to shout out the Dig podcast, because having that platform was willing to work with me in these conditions to do this was part of it. So
that was great. Yeah, and we will talk about that assessment factor as well during this workshop. So stay tuned for that. There's some really cool things happening at Rutgers, but maybe also potentially problematic. We'll find out. But yeah, I think it's really brilliant how you're able to sort of bring your participants sort of into the public, right? Like the audio quality, just like the voice is so intimate. And I think it really feels like an intentional exchange whenever in all those clips and the other work that I've heard. And I will share a little bit too about sort of my process, not totally formalized, but I came into this work thinking about the relationship between research and development. I had learned in my previous work that this thing called development was actually this process that structured how all television was made, basically. These development executives who decide what shows get made, what films get made, and that being like the exclusionary practice. So I was like, okay, let me try and do development in a community-based way. You see intersectionality here, but you could substitute community, right? Because intersectionality is like necessarily community-based. It's a collective sort of understanding of who we are. And I was like, well, what's the role of research and development? Can we actually use research to develop with community? And when you think about development from a community-based level, it's not like HBO where you're just like writing a $10 million check. You have to really be actively engaged in supporting artists in production. You have to really support them in terms of distribution, providing actual resources, licensing fees. Now we have an app, which we didn't have, which was super great. And then in terms of exhibition, that was where I got a lot of my sort of research data that I think my department was kind of like interested in. And it really looks like, holding screenings in cities and bringing people together, working with artists to curate these screenings so that they reflect their values, right? So on the bottom left here, that's the screening we did for Brujos. Ooh, excuse me. I'll just have that play silently. And that was at the Chicago Cultural Center where we had a residency. It's in the middle of town. It's a very big theater. We could host a lot of people, which is great because at a certain point we did have 300 people wanting to see these things and we needed a big space. But Ricardo Gamboa, who did Brujos, was like, growing up in the hood in Chicago, I never went to the Chicago Cultural Center because I didn't feel like that space was for me. So we helped Ricardo organize a separate screening in Pilsen in the neighborhood that they grew up in like a bar that was Latino owned. And we brought people to this bar supporting local businesses and allowing people to watch the show, having drinks and dancing to music from Sadie Woods. Brown Girls did something similar for their screening in Pilsen. This is a show about women of color, brown and Black women sort of loving each other. There were performances across artistic disciplines from brown and Black women. And we all watched the show together, and Sam and Fatih were there as well. So here I am doing this community-based exhibition work, and I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, this is community, it's all wonderful, bringing people together. And then, this is 2017. A year after that, I started to like get wind of like conflicts that were happening in the community that I wasn't really aware of. And no one was telling me anything. And I was like, why isn't anyone telling me anything? And I think I reasoned that it was because I was like a professor and I had this like class privilege. I think maybe people didn't know like what I was doing with my data, right? Especially at that time, it's really hard to publish what I was doing because at this point I was only 3 years in, and I still didn't have like those concrete findings, right, that would be in peer-reviewed journal articles. So I wrote a grant to the Field Foundation, which supports Chicago artists, and thankfully the Field Foundation had been taken over by Angelique Power, who is a Black woman, and she was all like, we're only gonna fund people who are working in Black and brown communities in Chicago. And so Field Foundation funded us to have a head of community for the research project. So when you looked at that original schematic, right, I had all these things, but I didn't really think about community as a really core component, right, of how the process should work. I thought, oh, everything is community, but no, it's like something that actually needs to be intentionally cared for. And so I know that in Discord, someone asked me to talk about restorative justice. This is how we sort of built it in. So we hired Jenna Anist, who's pictured here, who is an artist, but also a healer. And they use they and she pronouns. They worked with me to come up with some frameworks with how we as a project engage community. They had been an actor in film and noticed how the production process can be really triggering and really harmful to people. It's a really high intense environment. You only have a certain amount of hours to get work done. It's a lot of moving parts. And amid all of that, you're dealing with people's really intimate personal stories, right? And sometimes stories that are about trauma, that are about harms that people have endured, survived. So they were like, yes, I really want to help you work out a process. We came up with a set of community standards, which is too long to really put here, and a way for us to engage community. And they also developed what we call brave space agreements, which we filmed. And these are things that we ask everyone to say when we show up in space, to sort of get us all on the same page about the fact that everyone in the space is equally valued, that people should feel empowered to speak up if something is not feeling right with them, and that we will do our best to sort of protect them. I won't play this because there's not enough time, but I'll post the link in the chat so you can watch it on your own time. And this process has since evolved. So we no longer have the head of community. Instead, we're really trying to see if there's ways in which we can facilitate healing and restorative justice across all of the organizations that we work with, because OTV is a network, a kind of distribution platform. We work with lots of different production companies, lots of different activist collectives. We're really just one node in a very complex lattice here in Chicago and increasingly nationally. So we want to become a facilitator. We realize we don't really have the resources to like do mediations with everybody, which is what Jenna was doing. Like whenever there would be a problem in production, artists would come to Jenna and say, hey, we had a problem in production. We're not talking, we can't finish this project, can you help? And Jenna mediated it and really helped get restorative justice on a really intimate level. But how do you scale that is definitely a challenge, and not a challenge that I saw myself getting into when I work with this process. But I think it is about that relationship aspect that both of you were talking about earlier, right? That like part of doing this work is valuing the relationships and the people over sometimes, or as much as the actual like data you're collecting and the things that are going to get you to stay in or rise within the institution. We're saying a lot of things, so please let us know if you have questions or comments. I have been able to keep track of the Discord, but we might move on unless you all want to comment on what you have said to kind of how did you turn these things into outputs. But first, like, I don't know if you have any comments or questions about each other's processes.
I do really quickly, like Chenjerai, like the what you were just sharing about creating space for knowledge production as being so important. And just to kind of give you like another different like look at impact. So that interview that you did with Ruthie for The Intercept, like that actually in different spaces that I have been of people who are doing abolitionist organizing has like really circulated, and like the quote that, especially that where she's like thinking through about abolition needing to be green and red and the transnational dimensions of that, and also like how we also have to think about this with environmental justice, has been something that has been really useful in like for like in framing different campaigns, like in framing and sharpening, and for folks like thinking through analysis. And so I've like been in spaces, right, like where people have like really talked like through the interview of somebody, a writer who had written for this like World Without Cages folio that I'll talk about in a little bit, like really like use that to think through like how does like abolition really, how are we thinking about it in South Asian diasporas, and like really looked back at this like interview with Ruth. So just also kind of thinking just how like these forms of knowledge production and how they can be used, and right, like foreground like forms of like movement building is so important, and that kind of space making work that you gestured to, I think is so critical and crucial. So I just wanted to share that back with you.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. No, I'm glad to see that. I mean, I feel I have seen it taken up I've been on a couple of like syllabi about abolition and stuff, mostly like public syllabi, right? I don't know what's part of the problem of public scholarship is that we don't necessarily have the mechanisms to track how things move in how things are being used even in the university. But it could be that could be the least important in some conversations, like, you know, the most consequential for our careers, but the least consequential for movements. Speaking of which, you know, I'm curious, like, you know, in terms of how your work has been engaging with the sort of politics around, you know, Asian American struggle and identity. You know, it seems like we in our popular discussion now, there's a really limiting formulation of just like anti-Asian hate as the thing. So I can imagine that with the kind of work that you were doing, that you showed us, and you know, you're trying to sort of complicate that public conversation, but also the extent to which formulations like that might be, and even if you're not like, if your research project isn't to focus on that, you kind of have to work around it if you're to raise some of these issues in the context of the academy. So is that something you could talk about a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to. And I think this will probably bring us into sort of like the next stage of the conversation. And I think so much of what I would also add in terms of public scholarship along those lines, right? So to kind of think through, I think like this kind of question of Asian American politics and scholarship, there was this moment in 2014 through 2016, and this kind of like, I think very first public moment, right, of Black Lives Matter, where a lot of Asian Americans like were publicly reckoning with anti-Black racism and like our communities, especially after a very public incident in which an Asian American police officer shot and killed, right, a Black man, Akai Gurley, in public housing projects in New York City, right, like doing a patrol where police are continually harassing residents in public housing, right? And so this was this moment where I think a lot of different organizations, especially among Asian American progressives, were thinking through what is the relationship of Asian Americans like with these structures of white supremacy, of anti-Blackness, and also police, right? And this like draws on a long history of Asian American politics that I'm not going to go into here. But I would say even at that moment, right, of like, if you kind of track this conversation also around abolition that has really been emerging, that you can also see political analysis grow in shape in different, like and transform, I think, in different spaces, because there's many ways there's a public conversation that has shifted from police accountability to police abolition, right? And I do think like the conversation of abolition has always been there, but I would say, right, like being and learning alongside like organizers who are doing on the ground work and sharpening that political analysis has in many ways like also, right, like informed all the ways that I'm thinking through things as well. And so kind of like flashing forward to this moment in both like 2020, 2021, like we are hearing a lot about like, right, like stopping Asian hate, or like, and also the government being like, we need to take hate seriously. And in so many ways that has coincided with the expansion of law enforcement, right? And so you have this kind of the wake of, or not the wake, like in the midst, right, of like ongoing pushes to end policing and mass incarceration. Then you're also seeing the uses of anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence being leveraged, right, like to expand like policing through either like hate crimes data collection, more training, right, like civil rights training for the FBI. And so like the kind of notion of like, we are going to like not tolerate hate, right? Like that's something that like in, for example, the NYPD police commissioner said, like when he was like, okay, we're going to expand like undercover plainclothes cops into Asian communities, which was like the very same unit that they dismantled or started dismantling in the summer of 2020, because they were like, oh, like plainclothes units are leading to a lot of fatal shootings. So there's like this contradiction that's happening, and I think a lot of organizers are pushing back against that. And I think but also, right, like I think still in a kind of like dominant progressive discourse still, right, like you're seeing language such as like we want to enforce civil rights, right, like as code for expansion of law enforcement. And so like that gets into really tricky terrain. And so I'll really quickly share screen of like two kinds of like, I think like public modes of scholarship, but I think it's just kind of like how are we using different forms of knowledge production to push against dominant discourses. And so just as like one example, in the fall, so this is in the aftermath, the NYPD formed this Asian hate crime task force in August 2020. Okay, and so they were again expanding policing in this moment and basically kind of thinking like, okay, there's like underreporting of these incidents to police officers. So we're going to create like culturally competent, like multilingual, right, like programs for communities to quote unquote like feel safer reporting to police, without, right, like the ways of thinking which like police in Asian communities has historically also been really harmful, and the ways, right, like that police forms of militarism and US empire has also then created, right, like the racialization of Asians as this quote unquote object of hate, right? And so kind of like policing forms of exclusion. So with that history, so the NYPD forms this Asian hate crimes task force. One of the things that like through the Asian American Feminist Collective that we did, as we were seeing in mainstream media, that there weren't many narratives that were pushing against this, right? Like it was just reported as a positive given, right? Like that something was being done about like anti-Asian racism. And so seeing that, like we decided just to kind of at least to create this counter narrative that like, no, like we don't want, right, like a culturally competent police force in communities, like we want cop-free communities in New York City. And so so we had created this letter, and you can access it here. It was just on Medium, and we had, I think, around like 27 different organizations sign, many of them like, and I think significantly are also queer and trans Asian American organizations. And I think this is important also given the legacy, right, of like in 2009, the expansion of hate crimes legislation to include like categories of gender, sexuality, and disability that was tethered to like the US Department of Defense, like expansion, budgetary expansion, right? And so there's like a legacy of queer and trans communities like pushing against this expansion of quote unquote hate, knowing that it is actually very harmful to communities in terms of how it's going to expand like forms of criminalization and punishment and policing. So we had put out this letter as like one form of intervention, and actually on Tuesday, as as a response, we're putting together a teach-in that's bringing together different organizers, including folks who had been organizing in the wake of 9/11, where there was increased acts of violence against like Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, right? And this kind of expansion of like counter-violent extremism, infrastructures that has been used to police Muslim communities, and at the same time now being used, right, like to police white supremacists. And so like we're kind of thinking through these different organizing strategies and bringing people together just to kind of share like if we are going to imagine cop-free communities in New York City and responses to anti-Asian violence in this moment without police, like what are some at least like strategies that we can collectively think through. So that just to answer your question briefly has been some ways, shapes, and forms like in which like some of these different forms of knowledge production are taking and also co-evolving, right? Like I think there's a lot of writing and people thinking through things in very live ways right now, including myself.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that, you know,
Wow.
like you said, there's
So powerful, yeah.
yeah, it's so powerful. I mean, there's a long tradition of Black Asian solidarity, but it does seem like we're in another moment where it feels so pressing. And it's great that you're doing this work. I mean, there's a Q&A in the chat that I think we maybe want to just touch on before we get to what we had planned next, which from Ajali asking, you know, if there's any practical suggestions for learning the technical skills and scholarly activist communities to do this kind of work. You know, I'm looking at your work, Rachel, and, you know, obviously we're seeing sort of a kind of ethnographic focus perhaps, but it's also like, everything's so well designed, you know, and there's like pamphlets and resources and things. And, you know, with you, Chenjerai, I think a lot of people are intimidated by podcasts and like, don't know where to start. And so, you know, how do we think about resourcing ourselves to do this work, intellectually and otherwise?
Well, let me just say that like two things. One is I often think about this. I've learned about this two ways. There's skills I brought to these projects that I learned as part of my critical scholarship, you know, which is part of what at times has made it disheartening that the efforts to bring those things into the public, if we're going to just go with that kind of, you know, weird sort of spatial metaphor, are not necessarily understood. They're understood as not important. It's like, you know, an example of this is, you know, I'm working on, well, anyway, I really want to get to make sure I answer the question here. So some of it is, you know, I think I recognize that because I stay kind of tech connected to some of the conversations that are happening in journalism and things like that, I'm aware of where some of the critical interventions I learned it through, you know, by studying really smart people in my field, the critical interventions I could make in popular conversations. And I probably had more patience than maybe some scholars have to actually participate in those conversations because, you know, I've had to endure like the looks I've gotten from other scholars when they're like, that's not where the really cutting edge conversations happening, like in journalism. That's like, you know, it's happening like in these papers or these other kind of texts. So, you know, you're not sometimes getting a lot of cultural capital in the academy from doing that. But by doing that, that gave me also the chance to learn how does it work in journalism. So I should also say, really, some Black women like Alicia Montgomery at NPR and some people who gave me chances to practice my journalism. The very important arts of editorial work, editors in various journalistic institutions who helped me get my sort of public writing up to speed and helped me to see how to do that. That was an important skill set that I learned that I can see some folks in the academy, you know, in our disciplines who are doing really important work, but the writing sometimes is not as accessible. And so the other thing I want to say is like, I also came into the field. There's a lot of things I learned, you know, there's a book by, oh God, I'm trying to remember the book. I'll talk about it. There's a book about dealing with public scholarship. I'll come back and post a link to the book. And one of the things they said was, never function under the illusion that the classroom and your research is enough. You have to actually go become a part of movements and do what might be defined as like the lower level work, the grunt work. It's not that you as a professor come into the community and you're there to drop your like wisdom and research on the community. It's the opposite of that. come sit there, maybe don't even let them know what you do, if possible, and just do make copies, send emails, clean up, take folding chairs, fold the folding chair, you're kicking the table after the event, like that type of shit, you know what I'm saying? And by doing that in different spaces and listening in various spaces and protest spaces, I came to understand what the work of organizing was. From organizers some of whom had relations to the academy, some of whom didn't, had a long time. So the organizing is like a key skill that I learned that has helped everything else. But again, it wasn't about an extractive, like I'm going to learn organizing so I can do research. That's how they tell you how it's supposed to work. But as you were talking about in the last panel, it doesn't work like that. And it shouldn't work like that, right? It shouldn't work. You're told you're supposed to end the relationship with people, with your subject at a certain point, so you can, in terms of like objectivity and partiality. No, and interestingly, this is also a common challenge we share with journalism, right? Journalism also has an extractive mode where people go get people and organizers and movements to pour out their stories, and then people go get book deals off that, and the movement gets what? Maybe a 800 word, So it's like, to me, like that was a skill set. Now, the last piece I'll say is kind of trying to reverse engineer some of what I did. There are skills, like production skills, that some of which I brought as a hip hop artist into the academy, about sound and knowing how to produce and stuff like that, that were helpful, but that could be built in if we're not functioning in a binary where there's like production on one side and research on another side, right? It's like, so some of my productions, we could create the capacities in the academy to do some of this work, to understand how these technologies work, because we understand that by doing that, you now will have a better chance to, for example, like, it was a powerful ethnographic research standpoint to work inside of a corporation like Gimlet, but you had to have some production skills to be able to do that. You know what I mean? So, but like, how do you get those? Is the university going to fund it, or is it just a neoliberal where the risk and skill building is offloaded onto you? So all those things were important things that I kind of was improvising to figure out, but we should try to formalize, and so that we can do it. And I think maybe some of the other scholars we talked to before have figured out better ways to learn these skills.
Yeah, I actually just want to jump in there because it's relevant to what I've done. I was fortunate at Penn to be there when John Jackson was still teaching, which maybe he is now, I don't know. And Catherine Stender was there. She was a scholar filmmaker. Paul Mazaris was there. So Catherine actually taught a class that was about like documentary production, and like we did a week on lighting and a week on editing. But then we also read theory, and she did it all in a semester, which was amazing. I will say that technical training was only so useful, and it helped me understand a little bit about the process. But I think you're right. Like, you got to be able to do the grunt work. Like when I had my dissertation turn the prologues of my book project, like I was a co-producer, but I was like running around in 90-degree heat, making sure the actor had water, or like, getting the food, cooking the food. When I started OTV, like I was moving chairs, cooking dinner for folks, like just anything that needed to be done. It's like, you should be the one to do it. And participants respect that. And then they're like, okay, you're really in this. Like, you're not just trying to extract. I think that's like super duper important, that like, yes, some technical skill helps. But like, if you look at OTV and you look at the things that I've produced versus the thing that other people have produced, my shit's not as good, right? Like, ultimately, you've got to work with other people, and to work with other people, you have to support them. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, I just want to echo all of that in terms of like this grunt work and this like less visible forms of work, right? And I think often in the academy, there's like, and we talked about like the kind of individualism, like the ego that like plays a role, and to set all of that aside to be like, how am I actually showing up, and showing up consistently, right? I think there's like a kind of practice of consistency that also, that I think both of you are really speaking to. And I think, yeah, like a lot of the ways that I participate, like that I don't often talk about in terms of that, right? Like, it's like writing a meeting agenda, like you're staring at people's different schedules and thinking really, at least in New York City, right? Like, you're like, okay, where do I even find meeting space that's like accessible, like can have like multiple people there, like has Wi-Fi, like, people don't have to like access a building where there's a security guard, right? Like how are you kind of like navigating, right? Like these politics of space and organization and coordination. And so even outside of like kind of putting together those outputs, it's like this kind of, I don't know if like administrative or logistical is like the word that I want to use, but like I think there's like those forms of labor, and then also like the reproductive labor that you're both pointing to, right? Like that it's like, how do we feed people? How do we make sure that like maybe there's like that space for childcare, like at a meeting, and I feel like that like work is often so, it is so important, tends to be undervalued in movement spaces as well as in like academic spaces that are thinking about like community organizing and movement work. So I just like want to co-sign, right, like that the grunt work as like a central part of community work, and as a central part as like just a central part of like also how are we co-building like environments to kind of coexist together that isn't reproducing these extractive hierarchies around like labor, of work, and of value. And so like that the grunt work is so much of actually how people are able to provide spaces of care for one another that is trying to also undo, right, like these really extractive and uneven systems of violence and oppression. So yeah, so grunt work as like a kind of, I think like as like forms of care really, I think is also what I hear you both saying and also getting at. And I do like, as a quick pause, like just to also answer like the question too on like the technical work, I think that is like something that does take time and practice, and how do we get that to be resourced and not be exclusive, right? Like to people who have a ton of skills and training. I think institutional spaces can also be better at offering their resources for people to learn these skills. I think like what are ways though that like we can make different forms of software skills and training also accessible to in different community spaces, right? I think often these forms of labors like are hard to access more generally. And I would also be upfront and say like my undergraduate training was in a communication and journalism school where I learned how to use Adobe InDesign as like part of my undergraduate training, right? But I didn't have access to critical theory. And I think that's also maybe like at a level of field that we can think about of like what's happening in like journalism and communications, like schools versus I think like schools of media and communication, where there are questions of like how we're theorizing questions of power, that also then like as somebody who came out of a journalism school that I didn't have access to those, and it's like weird how like also the institutions like silo I think these like areas of right, like quote unquote expertise and skills trainings apart. So I'll pause there though around the technical stuff.
Can I know we got to get to assessment. I know we keep kicking the assessment down the road, but there's one thing I got to bring in on this same note. When we talk about building the capacity, you know, at Rutgers, I'm just a humble rank and file member of a Rutgers AP union and AUP union. And it's, you know, we have an incredible union campaign happening at Rutgers. And often, you know, union politics of a university are positioned as separate from the research kinds of questions we're talking about, or even often as a distraction, right? Like definitely, you know, I to be honest, I sometimes have to stop myself from telling my graduate students, like, are they spending too much time in the union work? But I don't tell them that ever, because the reality is that the union work is literally the work that's shaping the conditions under which they can maybe do scholarship, can do public scholarship. It also, the union work is also the space where we can try to break some of the hierarchies around, you know, tenure track faculty versus part-time, you know, non-tenure track faculty, other kinds of workers. The union space is also the work where we can force our internal university campaigns to think about a notion of public good, as the Chicago Teachers Union has done, as people have done in California, right? So that it's not the power of the union, it's not simply about getting people in the university better jobs, but about actually wielding the coercive power of our labor to transform the state of New Jersey and beyond, right? And so, like, we shouldn't, when we talk about all these things we're talking about, right? Like money, whether people have the space to learn technical skills, whether they have enough time, you know, what is the coercive force that can really cause people who don't want to think about knowledge in different ways to have to slow down and say, and really defend some of these horrible discourses that they have about rigor, right? What is the coercive force beyond just talking to each other that can force them to confront this, right? And some of the, and in a way, you know, it's the union, right, that I think does that without romanticizing the union. Our union battle is very complicated. There's different entities who are fighting with each other, but I do think that that's an important thing to bring into conversation. And Rachel, I think you mentioned that at this moment, NYU is on strike, right?
Yes, the NYU Graduate Student Union, the grad students are currently on strike. So encouraging everybody to support them as they're currently advocating for their demands right now, and also expanding, right, like the scope of what it means to advocate for labor justice at universities. Like, for example, some of their demands are also, right, like how are we getting like cops and public safety off campus, right? Like that, right, like is a public safety risk that is also putting students of color, like who are like on campus at the university at risk. So I think like those are these like moments as like people are advocating to really also think expansively about like all these different ways that racial and economic justice are intertwined. And like we'll also name, right, like the ways that institutions, and I know next week will be about like how do we advocate for survival in the institution, but I do know like often, right, like the institution itself like uses this tactic of like, well, we move slowly as a way to delay when people are really advocating for like their material benefits to be able to feed themselves, like pay rent and all of those things. So I think that's both really important to name. So yeah, thank you for drawing attention.
All these things are so interconnected. I'm thinking about unions. I think about unions a lot because that's weird. I just got a consent anyway. I'm thinking about unions a lot because, you know, a lot of the work that I found out that I was doing is that the people that I was working with weren't able to get into unions. You know, in film and television, unions are highly exclusionary. And so people don't have access to quality work, and the work that I was doing sort of organizing people was in a way a kind of organizing, though clearly impossible without institutional resources. That it's institutional resources that unions need to, right, survive and provide all those benefits and resources. So I'm thinking about that in connection with the conversation around grunt work and technical skills, and how actually doing that organizing work allows you access to learning about technical skills. Like you learn when you build with people and you organize people, right? There are other people with skills that can teach you if you're willing to give them something that they need. So I want to make sure we keep this conversation moving. I mean, we could talk about that for probably another 30 minutes, but let's talk about the outcomes and assessments of this kind of work before we get too close to time. Because I think people really think about this a lot. You know, they want to engage the public, but they're like, how do I produce a paper out of it? Or how do I produce anything that's going to get recognized by my institution? What do I produce, right? So yeah, I mean, we've already shared some of the kind of products of this work. You and Rachel have. So I'm not sure if you want to talk about the ways in which you then share that with your institutions or any other bodies. Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk about that. I'm putting in the chat here something I'll get to in a moment, which is a sort of rubric for public scholarship, a way for that to be considered in tenure cases that Rutgers has introduced and is now discussing and trying to integrate. I think, you know, the reality of it is that, you know, you have to be strategic in this context. And I think that, you know, for me, part of the challenge is that a lot of times a lot of the things you see have come out of me experimenting, you know, doing what I thought was important first, and then thinking about the research projects that could come out of it. You know, when I was a graduate student, I was able to incorporate some of this form of at least engage. It's a little different than public scholarship, but kinds of public scholarship into the actual dissertation process. But often, you know, for example, things that I wrote, I was able to do some scholarly writing around things that happened in Ferguson and live streaming in the Black Lives Matter movement. That was stuff, you know, I wasn't like, I wasn't going to wait until I could kind of pass through various kinds of institutional structures. I needed to be there as a person, as a Black person. I just needed to be there at those places. And then I was then thinking about what could I do that was useful. And, you know, one thing I could do was to witness, right? Because we know that live streaming was really important. So then I later did figure out how to write about it, but some people are a lot better at that. For me, I think I tend to go native a lot and then forget what my real, you know, I'm like, oh, you know, even that language, right, of empire. But it's like, so I think like, but where possible, yeah, you know, there's ways to write and to be aware of where your interventions might fit into conversations that are happening. I mean, that may seem obvious, but it's important. And I think that, you know, because part of it is paying a lot of attention and reading, honestly, a lot of scholars who are doing this kind of work enable me to at least see, oh, I'm not alone here, right? And so in some ways you may have to push past the curriculum that might be being laid before you. To be honest, I had great education. I'm very proud of my graduate education, but there was only a few scholars out of the people that I met who were really even talking about any kind of public or participatory work. So I had to really seek that out to understand how that work is done. So that's important. You know, I've published from things. There's a lot of conferences are really important as spaces to bring things together that kind of count. And you know, but I gotta say, you know, where it ultimately counts, and I think where it comes down is, you know, for tenure track professors, you got to look really closely at what is going to count, and you got to look at it realistically. You got to look at it early, and you got to think about, there is a lot of power in writing narratives that make the case for it. But, you know, one last thing I'll say before I share this workers thing is that that they did is, early on in my career, there was a scholar who was a colleague of mine named Deepa Kumar, who was doing incredible engaged research, you know, and she said, you have to get used to translating the things you're doing to a lot of different audiences, okay? One audience that I was not aware of, that I feel like in some ways I'm just learning now, is like the idea of like academic and university centers, right? Like if you don't come out of a deep academic tradition and you didn't get that in your education, you might not really understand what a center is. I'm sort of will admit that I did not really understand what a center really does and how, and at least understanding what a center does with all of the limitations and contradictions, that would have been a way I could have narrated stuff I was doing in ways that I probably could have got some funding for it and support, you know, or at least made a case and make a case for other people and push the center to be more accountable to communities. But I didn't even understand it. And to be honest, nobody explained that really to me, you know, because that was just a thing. Like some people are just getting grants and they're getting centers. And I'm like, wait a minute, what does the center do? What does the center produce? What counts? Is it you just put on events? That's what the center does? Or is it events and research? You know, how does that work? You know, what, like, it was confusing to me because I don't know, maybe I'm just too much of a capitalist. I just think in terms of other kind of outputs. So my point is, now that I know that, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, I can narrate a public, even like a political project in the context of what a center does and try to move it that way and have it count, you know? And of course, not all centers are created equal. I see Angela say, what do centers do? Yeah, I mean, some of them are, as one person described it, some of them are like literally a set of bullet points on a piece of paper in someone's drawers, while others are doing far more. So I think those are things, you know, Rutgers created this document that's a criteria for evaluating publicly engaged scholarship. What's great about that is that I think people in the university fought for this. And so I never want to discredit it because it was like something that people fought for. I put the link in, you should use it. I think there's other resources we've made available that may have come into the last discussion that go beyond Rutgers. A limitation though, I will say, is that, you know, what does it mean when, you know, this comes from the university top down and tenure committees now have to evaluate this in terms of scholarships in a context where even your department and even your school that you're in may not be the only ones weighing in on the value of a tenure case, right? So, and some of those people are invested in really, you know, other, you know, really limited versions of what counts as scholarship. So the document like this Rutgers thing is a great ideal, it's something to move forward, but it's going to be interesting to see how it actually plays out and what it means once it gets tested on people's actual tenure cases.
Thank you for that. I did want to chime in because I think what I have to say dovetails really well. First, definitely hear you on, you just did it without thinking about how it would affect tenure, because sometimes with this work, I think Rachel, you probably identified this as well, there's just something going on in the world that you feel like you can contribute to, and you just have to do it. Like for me, it was like when I, you know, in the early 2010s, there was just no representation on TV. It was Scandal and that was it. And I was just like fed up. I was tired of watching white dudes on TV. And I also saw Netflix jumping into the game, and I was like, oh, but the historical trends around technology and representation means that there's going to be more, and I can be more effective if I start now versus when I wait till 2019 when I actually have tenure, right? So definitely hear you on that. I want to say that, for thinking about tenure evaluations, my advice would be get to know the senior scholars in your field who are also doing it. I'm pretty sure that Josh Kuhn wrote for me for tenure, and he was doing this work, and I had been introduced to him. And so having people who've done the work in your tenure case, writing in the letter saying this public work is scholarship and it is great, is probably super important. I don't know, but people tell me that it wasn't the center of my tenure case, but it was part of my tenure case. You can get to know who some of these scholars are through like workshops or things that happen through the association. So I just pasted the ICA 2017 theme book. Lisa Henderson has been super important in advocating for this within the communication field, and she gathered a bunch of scholars to write things for the theme book on this question of making and doing. That led to a group of scholars working on multimodal scholarship within the field that was a little bit bigger than it was in the theme book. Then the pandemic hit and we kind of slowed down, so hopefully it picks back up. But there's a lot of very senior people who want to support this work. Larry Gross was there, John Jackson was there, Lisa Henderson was there, like a lot of like tenured people who want to make sure that it can be possible for junior faculty to get tenured based on this work. So that's what I would say. Track the people, find the people who are senior than you who will vouch for you. Rachel, what do you have to say about this? I think you might have a different perspective.
Yeah, well, I will also just name, right, like as we're kind of thinking about what it means to make space, I think also so much of the work as scholars of color who are also invested in public scholarship work, hearing both of you talk, right, it's also like, how are we, like right now in the midst, right, of creating different structures in which our work can be translatable and also legible. And I would say, right, like as a grad student, did a lot of work in supporting the setup of like the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, which I know you're part of, and seeing people in the audience, right, like lots of folks, and folks who have really done like grunt work of like, how do you set up a center, maintain it for scholarship and networks and for things to thrive in these ways. Because I do feel like when kind of even coming into academia several years ago, I was like, who are the scholars of color like doing, right, like critical work on technology and digital media? How do we find them? How do we find each other when like everybody's kind of siloed away from each other, right? Like being the only lone person like at their institution. And so I think so much of like also what it means to like be able to set up these spaces and networks, as you're saying, right? Like finding those senior people who your work can translate to and speak to is so important, and creating those spaces of just like ongoing forms of support. Because I think as we've reiterated, right, like this journey is not an individual one, but it like for so many scholars, there's so much work in finding your people, like in going to a new institution, right? It's like who, like the kind of, I think the time, right, like in labor that it takes to kind of like bring community together in different ways. And I think that's like probably the short thing that I would add to that is, right, like how are we in ongoing ways creating these communities for ourselves, like in order to be able to like live and survive in this industry that keeps us apart so often.
I mean, I will just say that as someone who's very busy, when a junior scholar messaged me, grad student, where at whatever level you're at, and you're like, I'm doing community engaged work, I'm doing production work as a research process, like, do you want to review my stuff? Do you want to take a meeting? Like, I will take that meeting, and I will make time because it's super important to me, right? And I think a lot of senior scholars of color, especially, but even senior white scholars who do publicly engaged work are just like politically invested in changing academia, and like will take the time to mentor, write letters, like do whatever they can to support junior scholars. Not everybody, but there's more of us than maybe you think. Sorry, I interrupted.
Now, one thing I want to just jump in and say too is, part of this, and let me just clear, you ever hear the hip hop lyric that says, everybody want to tell you how to do it, they never did it? That's me right now. I have not gotten tenure, and I'm sitting here. But like, the thing about it is, I know that some universities have really specific criteria that are super specific to their university. And I think that those kind of criteria are important to be literate with and to try to strategize around. But, you know, you guys also think about what is going to hit a broad, you know, like what's going to get your work out there beyond just the university community. It's really important because, and when I say your university community, meaning, and one thing that does do that is books. I got to say, like if you write a book, you know, I mean, the good thing about a book is if you write a book and promote it a little bit, it goes beyond even like a really narrow journal community. It's like now, and what that does is in a context where we know that like people's tenure cases, even people who have tenure are under attack. And, you know, obviously having like unions and that kind of support is part of that. You also want other people be in the academy to be able to speak to the power and importance of your work. Now, my strategy has not, you know, I'm working on a book, but that's, you know, that's a struggle for me like it is for most folks who write a book. But another thing I found is that public scholarship, right? So for example, if you can position your research in conversations that are happening like in places like NPR or in, you know, in other media outlets, and you get good at recognizing like this is the moment, this is the intervention, then that's another way you can circulate it. That's not something that a lot of people always tell you. They tell you to move away from that. But what I found is, you know, if your work gets out there, people go know about it. And those people include scholars who may be weighing in on your case. So don't be shy. And at the same time, I'm mindful of what Rachel was saying in terms of care, because when you do that kind of thing, you know, I find universities very happy to be like, oh yes, do all this extra work, promote yourself, make our university look good, do engaging stuff, and also do the other stuff. And we're not going to really like worry about you too much, and you might burn out and have health issues and all this other stuff. But you know, it's important. So you know, just be mindful of that too. But I'm an advocate of being a self-promoter.
Yeah, I mean, I think the previous panel was like, be wary of self-promotion. Definitely be wary of self-promotion for sure. And I don't have time to tell the stories about like the times I was on covers of magazines and my participants got mad at me and I had to like mediate all of that. That's like a thing. So it's a problem with doing the work. It also is just like kind of icky. However, if you happen to stumble upon something from where there's popular interest, it can help you continue to do the work. And I will just give the very concrete example that I shared in the previous panel where before, in the first 2 years of OTV, when I was showing in community-based spaces and artist-run spaces, my department told me to get another job. They were like, you're not publishing in peer-reviewed journals. You gotta go. You gotta find another gig where these things matter, because it doesn't matter here. And then cut to like 6 months later, one of the artists I helped happens to create a hit show called Brown Girls. And I'm putting the whispers around the department that they're meeting with all these Hollywood studios and there might be Emmys and all this stuff. And then it's a different conversation. Now it's like, oh, we want to keep you and we want to fund this work. Here's 6 figures that you can disseminate to your community to keep doing this, you know? So like, I leverage the public awareness of the work and the soft amount of celebrity that it created around me to like continue to pay my collaborators, continue to do this organizing work. And now the team that helped me build this platform are working for OTV with full-time salary and benefits. And we are able to offer fellowships to people and stuff. So like, be strategic about it, but like, and unfortunately, do the traditional things. Like I will just share, you know, this slide of like how I leverage Brown Girls for the traditional work, right? Like I used all of the websites that wrote about Brown Girls, which like excited my department, you know, Time Magazine, MTV, all these people wrote about Brown Girls. I coded that by community. I actually found that intersectionality was critical to that circulation. Women's publications, queer publications, brown publications were like really pushing this. And I published it in Social Media and Society, right? So like, unfortunately, I had to do both. And you might too, especially if you're an R1, but the work can pay off. Like it can be a light at the end of the tunnel. Sorry to interrupt you, Rachel.
I just, because I said I'm a champion of self-promotion. I just want to jump in and say, like, I want to be crystal clear. I hope that what was also clear is I'm saying, find places where your work is relevant to a larger conversation, not just like you're promoting you as a thing, which some people do. But if the work is relevant, get that. I'm saying promote that, just to be clear. So
Right. I wasn't promoting myself. Brown Girls was being promoted, and I was like, hey, I helped them.
The thing that I would just like, the two things I would also just like add, as I know where our conversation is coming to a close, I think echoing the thing I will also be transparent about, right? Like the zine that I shared about like the COVID, about like Asian American feminism and the time of COVID, like translated that into also an article for social media and society, right? Because I think there is a reality, right? Like making a zine, I know is not, to be very realistic, is probably not going to be legible in different ways. Like I think was a tremendous public impact. And so there was a different way of like translating that in ways for audiences to also kind of like think about like what circulates. And I think the other piece too that I've been reflecting on is that there's also different hierarchies of value for public scholarship that also needs to be named, right? Like not all public scholarship. And I think often the very critical and necessary work is like not valued the same way, for example, at institutions like a well-known and well-placed like media hit. And I think like that's also really tricky, like knowing that also, right, like these mainstream media institutions are also very exclusionary and very extractive, right? Like they operate on a rapid response model as well. It's like, how do you write a book at the same time when you're like, oh God, like I need to like write this op-ed tomorrow because like 3 days from now, like maybe people will stop caring. And so there's like this like weird extractive cycle that also then emerges in terms of how, like what forms of public scholarship get valued by institutions. And I would also say that also for like scholars, especially people of color, like what is also really tricky is like media institutions often don't care about like stories or experiences unless it's in moments, right, of tremendous grief, trauma, and violence. And that like, right, like I will also name that like a lot of the kinds of ways that the Asian American Feminist Collective has been doing this work, right? Like it wasn't until the aftermath of the shootings in Atlanta. And I think this is very true for like many different Asian American scholars of like who have been pushing narratives. And it was like in this wake of tremendous violence that like every media outlet was like, where can I find an Asian woman that I can talk to like at this time? And like, and you would please respond urgent, like within 48 hours, right? And so there's like also then this cycle of like forms of extraction that replicate themselves in these different ways. So that's kind of like one of my final closing thoughts too of like public scholarship, that how difficult it is often to do given the conditions in which we work.
I mean, thank you so much for shouting that out, because it's like one of the contexts that I had to put in the Social Media and Society article, and we'll write more about in the book, is like OTV's never gotten that much press as when that Brown Girls thing happened. And I think it's no surprise that it was exactly mirroring the Trump's election. Like the trailer launched 2 weeks before the election, the show premiered 2 weeks after inauguration, and every white editor at every publication was like, can we have a story about not white supremacy? Oh, there's this cool little show about women of color. Let's write about that instead, right? So like, I think there's I mean, we started this talking about time, and there is the length of time in terms of being embedded in the challenges of publishing. There's also the ways in which time speeds up sometimes with historically marginalized communities, and how that deflects from your responsibilities to the institution because your communities are going through necessary needs and trauma. So there's like so much to balance in this work. And a lot of times when people ask me if they should do it, I just tell them don't, because it's really hard. But ultimately, hopefully it's rewarding. I think, you know, I will let you all close us out on potentially a note about the rewarding aspects of doing this work, right? We've talked a lot about the challenges and how we've navigated them. I will say that it's like changed me as a person, and I feel like I've been able to build with my people, with other Black and queer people, and that has been, you know, honestly more than anything else that has come out of it.
I will.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. I'll just quickly build on that and echo that it is, I think, one of the most rewarding aspects is the relationships. Like, I feel like even in the scope of like the past few years, like the relationships, friendships that I've built with different people outside of the academy that have really like generated, right, like different projects that may not be like conducive to research, but I think have been really like life-giving. For me, that has been an aspect of this. And I think a constant reminder, right? Like that there is life outside of the academy in an industry that I think constantly kind of pushes you to always be working and to kind of be subsumed under an academic identity. I think like the relationships that have been cultivated have just done so much work in kind of offering forms of support. And also I think like offering the kinds of community that have really pushed, challenged, and critically, right, like furthered the work like through ongoing conversations with people. So yeah, I would say the relationships have been one of the most rewarding aspects.
I would say that, you know, obviously, I agree with everything y'all are saying, and I think that obviously, like, sort of my personal rewards are maybe the least, for me, like the least important thing. But on that note, I'll say that, you know, to be honest, like as a scholar, like, you know, given what I signed up for and what I do, I understand if my institution is like, you know, we signed you up to make bread and you ain't, you know, you're making something else, you know, and it's like, which means that like, you know, if I'm counting for my sort of self-worth to be recognized by my peers in those ways, then, you know, I wouldn't be. So this, you know, and I'm not trying to stunt, but it is helpful to have millions of people in other places who do recognize the value of your work. And also, more importantly, communities who are saying like, we were able to use this stuff as part of organizing, which is the real impact here, which is like, to me, the measure of the work is like how useful is it to communities and movements in struggle. That's ultimately what the measure is, right? And you know, moments when I'm in the work with people, not where I'm necessarily standing out, but just where like I can see that something we're doing, or we're able to subvert the university or use it to like push forward an agenda. That is where I feel like, okay, I'm approaching the compass is kind of where we're supposed to be on this. And so I would like to have job security. I hope I get it, but also everybody in the university, whether you're tenure track or not, deserves job security, you know? So some of this is not how can I get job security and tenure, but how can we create a world in which people are not insecure in their jobs, period, right? So like, you know, that's what I gotta say.
Amen, Ashe. I haven't seen any other questions go through the chat. The Discord has been pretty lively though. So I do want to offer participants the floor to comment, question. We've been very engaged with each other, so I hope we haven't been sort of crowding out and like letting y'all feel ostracized. That is definitely not our practice. But we have a lot to talk about. We really are passionate about this. So yeah, I'll just let it have 30 seconds of silence. Thankful for you too, Sarah. Okay, well, it seems like maybe we are at a stopping point. It is late, especially on the East Coast. So I want to thank Chenjerai and Rachel for taking the time to do this workshop. I was in the previous workshop and I was collecting a lot of the advice and resources that they were generating. We've also generated some. Chenjerai, I think you mentioned a book. If you can put that in our document as well. We're gonna compile these, and I believe that all of that can be published alongside the recording of this video on the Building Fugitive Academy website. So thank you again to Boston College, ILA, all of the sponsors, the co-organizers, especially Anjali, who truly was our fearless leader and really pushed this along and made sure this happened. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for your attention and time.
Thanks all. And thanks for facilitating us.
My pleasure. Okay, I think
thank you for the work putting this together. I know this was a lot of work. Y'all have unfolded this incredible. So excited. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's been great. It's really fun. So yeah, I think that's it. I think it's my responsibility to end this Zoom. So I'm gonna end it. Okay, y'all.